Coach Patrick Henner, welcome back to the Running Effect podcast. A pleasure and privilege to say those words, as I know this one's going to be a special one. Our first conversation was absolutely delightful, and I know this one's going to be substance packed. So, how are you doing this morning?
Doing well, Dominique. Great to be here again.
First question for you off the top of my head. We are recording this on December 17th, and I think cross country is officially over for the high schoolers out there. Foot Locker is like the last national meet. And then for the collegiates out there, the NCAA meet was about a month ago. And so I think we're in this unique period where we're transitioning from cross to track, and we're in the thick of probably winter training, indoor training, and athletes are thinking, how do I get better? What are the things I need to do to take my running to the next level? Question for you off of that is, throughout your long tenured coaching career, what are things the best athletes are doing in this next month or so out of cross into indoor track? And what are things the worst athletes do? Basically, what do the best athletes do? What do the worst athletes do? And how can the athlete listening today avoid those pitfalls and do the right things?
Well, I think what's really interesting, what we've seen the last several years, is that if you look at what's happening now and look at like what the UNC guys did in the 3000, they're coming off cross country. They have a week kind of to recover from cross country nationals, do a couple tune-up workouts, and they run huge PRs in the 3000, the 5000. The mile times are fast, and so it's just a very interesting thing where I think people think that, in cross country I have to train one way, and then when I get to indoor and outdoor track I have to train something completely different. But I think the evidence now is showing that maybe that's not true. Maybe what you're doing all summer and all fall, has really set you up for success. So, yeah, I think you do have to make some tweaks. But at the same time, I think the evidence of what these guys are doing at that BU meet in early December shows that, maybe all those specific workouts we thought you used to have to do, maybe you don't have to do as many of them. I think the best athletes, they understand that rest and recovery is important, but they don't get sloppy and they don't completely detrain. So I think that, yeah, you need a mental break coming off cross country, and maybe you ran at BU. You need a physical break so you can super compensate from the races and the workouts you did all fall. But at the same time, you don't want to get sloppy or completely detrain or, develop some bad habits during that little bit of a break period. I think the worst athletes are the ones who don't consistently make progress, or the ones who think they need some kind of huge break, or they're not confident and they don't take a break and they just keep training, or they train harder. So I think that the best athletes have a really good sense of, hey, I know I need to take it easy. I need to get some mental and physical recovery, but at the same time, I'm not going to get sloppy.
What's the science there behind something like doing 10K training, very specific cross country training? And then, this is a question I could ask Milt when I have him back on the podcast next, but doing that like really specific, cross training, running for a 10K in Madison, Wisconsin, preparing for that, to then running 7:30 in the 3K. As you mentioned, that probably wasn't thought about a few years ago. Even Graham Blank's similar example, cross training right into a 12:59. These
Yep.
are crazy times that you would think would only be run after a couple months of doing, VO2 max work, heavy, all the things to run for a 5K, not 10K on grass.
Well, I think, and just kind of the segue from my own experience last year with Hobbs was, his PR previously was 146, and he was doing heavy lactate LT1, LT2 training, a lot of aerobic work. Now we did do speed development, and he went to the LA to run an 800, and I was like, man, he's not done much specific work. And I actually talked to Milt about it once, like, I'm kind of nervous about this, and you know, and he went there and he ran 145 pretty easily. So that's just another example. I think with the same thing with those UNC guys, that, if you're hitting all the different elements of training, then I don't know if you necessarily need as much real specific training at the designated paces, with heavy lactate like we used to think you had to do. And if you think about Strand and Parker, Ethan and Parker, they both are very fast athletes. I mean, their PRs in the mile. Um, so they have that speed reserve, right? And I know that it wasn't like all fall Milt was doing a whole bunch of 400s, 200s, 300s at like 60, like their 3K pace, 60 point, 60 flat or whatever. So I think they're talented athletes that have that speed reserve, and then they were obviously based on what they did, at the end of the cross country season. They obviously had the fitness.
One thing that's top of mind here as you're speaking there, something that I think frequently gets talked about, at least in the high school cross country circles when I would go to races when I was a competitor in high school, would be they would always joke about the 800-meter kid who got looped into doing cross country, who was really good at the 8, maybe broke 2 or whatever they would have run. They'd always say, "Oh, I'm so excited to see him like hawk everyone down in the last 100." But the athletes who run the race properly, it's rarely the 800 guy who has the best kick at the end of the race. Normally, it's the guy with the best strength who gets to 100 meters to go and still has something left. Normally, the 8 guys are pretty strained. And to a national global level, this conversation has started to be exemplified in something like the 10K, where now the conversation is how do you run 26 and change pace and still have enough to close in 53, right? It's not now a conversation of like who has the best kick per se. It's how do you run really, really fast and still be strong enough to run what guys used to close in. What's the science and thought process behind something like that, where a lot of times it's the guys with the best strength who have the best kick? And how different are those two things, or do they line up?
No, I think they line up 100%. I mean, I'll go back to two things. So, what's taking place during the actual kick? Um, and once again, I think that comes into speed reserve and technique, right? So, how you're able to manipulate your arms and legs in that last 120 meters. Okay. So that's one aspect of it. And I think that comes from specific like speed development training, the weight room, and things like that. But then the other thing and what you're referring to is, how aerobic are you up to that point where the real racing starts, right? So if somebody's more fit and more aerobic up to that point, then they're going to access more of their a higher percentage of their speed reserve when they get to that final kick. So, and I think what's happened too is just that with the how everybody's training now with double threshold, the super shoes allowing you to do that much more volume of training. I think athletes are running these races, 1500, 5K, 10K much more aerobically, and therefore they can finish faster at the end.
Going back to a few points ago when you were discussing things the worst athletes do, one of those was, not taking a break. Can you break down for me the science of detraining? Specifically, I think in a culture where comparison is starting to take over for a lot of athletes, and they feel like maybe if their season didn't end on a high note, they got to keep training. They've got that chip on their shoulder. And scientifically, you're probably only doing yourself a disservice if, the week after your biggest race, you're still running track workouts. Like, take a week to chill.
Yeah, exactly, Dominic. And I think that, if you look at it on a micro scale, every time you do a hard workout or a hard session, your fitness is going to dip, right? Until you recover. And then hopefully your recovery puts you up above that spot you were previous to the hard workout or hard session, which they call that super compensation. So you're kind of looking at that wave on a regular basis, on almost a daily basis or a couple day cycle, 48, 72 hours. But then I also really firmly believe you're looking at that as a microwave as well too, where after a complete season or a macro cycle, that getting that recovery and taking that break, and that's going to involve more than just what you might do between two hard sessions during the week, but it might require a number of days off. It might require a week or two of just jogging or no running. So to get that super compensation after a season is going to take, even more recovery than it does on a daily basis.
I know the sport is very individualistic as it should be. Not one program is going to fit 10 people. It should be tailored a little bit to individual needs. But what's Coach Henner's general protocol for an athlete listening after something like a long cross season, assuming they were healthy? What should that week to 2 week period after that look like?
It would really just depend on the like you were just saying, the specific athlete. You have some athletes that are hitting the NCAA cross country meet and then maybe going to BU and they're on an upswing, right? Um, and they've trained great the whole fall, all summer, all fall, no hiccups in the training. That athlete might need um, a pretty substantial break. Maybe it's like jogging every other day for 2 to 3 weeks. Something like that. You might have another athlete whose training was interrupted, right? And they ran well at NCAA cross country, but they didn't really have the continuity of training all summer and all fall that you would have liked. So therefore, you might say, "Hey, we need to take a couple of days easy to recover from this race, but then we need to kind of, get back into some low intensity training just so that we can, start building that base."
This is kind of open and broad, and I'm not sure I have the answer here, which is probably why I'm asking you the question. At the college and pro level, it seems there's actually quite a bit of turnover with the best cross country runners and the best track runners. College, Grant Blanks, Parker Wolf, those guys do it at both levels. At the pro level, Jakobs, I mean, we could talk about him for ages, but just destroys everyone in cross and then also, kills it on the track. At the high school level, something that's interesting and very front of mind as I got back from the Foot Locker Cross Country National Championships on Sunday, and you think to NXN, and this doesn't happen every year, but I feel like it's happened in recent years. A lot of times the winners are not that good at track. And now, granted, I'm a guy who was never that fast in high school and have no way or reason to say that good because I was significantly slower than them. But the guy who won this past weekend, Tam, he ran fast at track. I think he made the New Balance Outdoor National meet, but he wasn't breaking four. NXN winner Charlie Voss, I think he ran 4:07 in the mile. Again, good time, but and you look at his 2 mile time. I forget what it is, but it's nothing mind blowing compared to a lot of the other guys in the field who are low fours will probably break four this year. What's your general thought process on the differences between cross and track and why the winners a lot of times can be vastly different, specifically at the high school level?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is those two winners, recent winners, Foot Locker and NXN, it'll be interesting to see what they do this upcoming track season, right? So maybe their improvement curve in high school was a little slower, and they might have been a little bit behind last year or last spring even. But over this past summer and fall, they physically matured. Their training went better, and now all of a sudden they're beating guys that ran a lot faster than they did at track. So I think in high school and in college, really, that's something that people overlook is that improvement curve, and everybody's curve is going to be different, right? And that's one thing that has me, to be honest, just kind of going into a different area of like, with all these new roster limits that they have in college track now, like the SEC roster limit and cross country is 10. It's like, what about those kids that aren't going to hit their peak until they're senior year of high school or even a sophomore, junior in college? Like, it's going to be a lot tougher situation for them. So I think the first thing I would say is just like, it'd be interesting to follow those two winners and just say, hey, okay, was it an anomaly that they're better in cross country and track, or was it that just their improvement curve was a little bit slower than some of the people who ran faster than them in track, right? And then I think also, especially now, track times are so, and I don't want to, diss anybody, but if you get in the right race at BU, all right, good pacing, you don't have to make any moves, super shoes, all that kind of stuff. You can run a really fast time. And same thing in high school. Like, if you get in the right situation, the right weather, the right shoes, right pacing, all of a sudden, a 4:06 guy runs four flat, right? Or a nine flat guy goes to Arcadia and runs 8:45. And so, I think that in track, it becomes a lot more of like, hey, what kind of situation did you run that time in? Is that a repeatable? Can you pretty much run close to that time in a lot of different situations? So I think those are the two things I would comment about. What you're talking about.
I actually just had Charlie Voss on the podcast yesterday. I had a conversation with him, the kid who won at NXN this year. And a point I brought up to him was my conversation with JoJo Jordan this past probably January after JoJo broke 4 minutes in the mile, ran 3:59 point at some New Balance Indoor Grand Prix meet. And the conversation with JoJo that I asked him about was, he won NXN, was a big underdog. No one was talking about him going into the race. I asked him, to what extent do you feel like winning that race gave you the confidence and the swagger to then show up to these races and make big swings, like run a sub 4 mile? And he was like, big time. And so I was asking Charlie, do you think that it's going to be the same for you? And he was like, yeah, I do think this race gave me a lot of confidence. In terms of your history of coaching, in your experience, how often has that happened with an athlete where they win a race and then it kind of literally winning a race is the missing piece of validation that they can do the things that they think they can, and then they go out and do them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. I mean, whether it's a big PR, or you beat people, or you finish right with people that you didn't think that you could run with, because as you know, and I know, like a big part of this is, racing is mental, and do you really believe that you can go out and race with those guys? So winning a big race like Foot Locker or NXN, like, yeah, all of a sudden you're like, hey, I don't care if I'm running a mile or 2 mile or whatever. Hey, I beat these guys in cross country. I know I can run with them. And so I think I think that's a big part of it. And I think that's, to me, that's a big part of the art of coaching. Um, I think it's something that, Chris Miltenberg is really good at, of putting his guys in situations where they can succeed, and both in training and in racing. And I think that's one of his kind of underlooked coaching qualities. And if you see how he, brought along those two guys, Strain and Wolf, like he really mentored them and put them in situations where they could progressively get better, and kind of kept them out of situations where they might get kind of stomped on or destroyed or something like that. Because so I think that's a often overlooked part of coaching. And I think you know in developing young U.S. distance runners, I think it's very, very important that you understand that process.
Obviously, you're not a current head coach within the NCAA, but if you were, I'm curious to hear about what kind of progression you would follow in the context of, we're seeing different patterns specifically in the indoor season, but a little bit in the outdoor season as well, where you kind of mentioned it. We'll have people who only go to BU or only go to UW, which is like the fastest 300-meter track in the country. They'll only put themselves in these like check the box time trial situations. They'll only go after PRs. Outdoor, you mentioned Arcadia for high schoolers. That's 100% the BU for high schoolers.
Yeah,
You got 9 flat guys who have no business running 840, and kudos to them. Like, incredible
yeah,
time. It's smart to put yourself in this situation. On the other hand, you do have schools that maybe a little less budget, or just different circumstances, and they really never get the opportunity to run at a BU. But they put themselves in situations where almost every race isn't that fast, but it's very tactical, and they learn, tactics of good races. How do you think about, not even like different tracks, but different types of situations? And if you were a coach, what kind of path would you follow? Would you mix the two? Would you go just the BU route, just the racing route? Because I think a lot of times we see athletes who, can run 13:20 in the 5K, but could never win a 13:45 race because they have no tactics, and vice versa.
yeah. I mean, so it's important to look at two different things. So one is, okay, if you've got an athlete who can score at the NCAA meet, right? You have to go somewhere and get their qualifying mark, which these days is just become kind of ridiculous of what you have to run, right? In the mile, 3,000, so you almost have to go put yourself in almost a time trial situation to guarantee that you're going to get that, because you don't have many stabs at running a really fast 3,000 or 5,000 indoors, right? Or even outdoors, but obviously outdoors through the regional system, it's not as imperative that you run really fast times. And you don't want to make the athlete go out there and run, try to run a really fast 5,000, miss the mark by a couple seconds, and then they have to go out and do it again. So to get your qualifying marks, or let's say you're, one of those athletes that's just out of college trying to get a world championship standard or something like that, you almost have to go to those time trial situations on a fast track, good conditions, good pacing on all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, and once again, I would also go back and point to Milt as somebody who's really good at this. Um, you have to be in situations where it's not going to be a smooth, clean race the whole way. You have to learn how to deal with that. And a lot of, one of the beauties of the college system is you have to run like your conference meet and things like that where it's times are out the door where you're just trying to score points, you're just trying to win. So I think I would say that like you have to do a mix. I think these days you have to go somewhere fast and get in a time trial situation, get your marks out of the way, but then you also have to know how to race too, because as you know, at nationals, they, instead of going through the first mile at 4:04, whatever they did at BU, it could be 4:30. And so I think that you have to have your athletes prepared for both types of situations.
This question is more tailored towards the high school athletes and coaches listening, although maybe this is a situation in college, but I've never heard of Parker Wolf being thrown in a 4x4. And that's exactly what I want to ask you about. High school, there's this allure to distance runners. The fastest are probably just fast enough where they can get by running the 4x4 a few times throughout the year, and they need to get the points. And depending on the high school you're at and how competitive the high school is in terms of like team scores and team titles and what races you're at, you will get thrown in, if you're the best athlete, 3-4 races. What's your take on putting athletes in very off distances, even like a 4x4? And what do you think the benefit of that is, if any?
Yeah, once again, it's just that art of coaching, I think, and just that. I love it. I love when you can put your middle distance runner in a 4x4. I mean, that's some work that it's really hard to mimic in practice, right? But at the same time, you have to be smart about it. If they're got sore hamstrings, or you just felt like they just ran, they ran into a wall in their last race, then maybe it's not a smart move. But I like it in the high school athletes. Now, I'm not saying over race, and I think you have to really monitor your athletes' efforts, whether it's high school, college, professional, or whatever. But I'm a big fan of racing a lot of variety of different events and distances. Um, and once again, it kind of goes back to that idea of speed reserve. Like, if I'm an 800-meter runner and now my PR in my high schooler, I can split a 49. Well, now going out in 53 is easier. Or I just, instead of running 201, I ran 155. Now I'm a mile race. It goes out in 204. That feels a lot easier. Um, and I think too that you don't want to miss out on the speed, power, athletic development that you get from running a lot of variety of races, and then especially some of those shorter races.
I'm going to use the example of a 4:15 high school boy, although you could extrapolate it to the college level, or if you're a high school listening who's run 5:25 in the mile, just shift the times in your mindset. So 4:15 guy, I feel like indoors generally pretty unstructured. A lot of schools don't have programs, so you run a lot of unattached races. We'll call this kid Jimmy for the sake of the question. Jimmy's 4:15 guy. He wants to run 4:09, right? I do know of high schoolers in these situations who will then run 4 miles over the next 6 weeks. And every time they will go out at 4:09 pace and they'll try to run 4:09 or whatever. They'll try to run 4:13 and then 4:11 XYZ. What's your general thought process going back to the tactics conversation of, maybe running in a heat or running in a race against 4:20, 4:25 guys sitting in second and third, waiting on your tactics and kicking with 600 to go? What's the benefit of something like that? Or shifting it up and running at 800 and working on running way faster than race pace. Like if you were this 4:15 guy coaching Jimmy, it was a 6-8 week season. He's 4:15 guy. Training's roughly there to indicate he can run 4:09. What races would you put him in? How would you work on his tactics as well as, being able to run a time like 4:09?
Yeah, I mean, a lot just depends on the type of athlete they are, right? I mean, you can get a miler who's more like an 8 100, 1500, or you can get a miler who's more like a miler 5,000 type. So that's one thing I would say. Um, the other thing too is that, I just would encourage racing. Like let's not worry about the time. And then, what if I'm running 4:15, 4:15, and then all of a sudden I close in 58 and I run a 4:13, and I'm like, okay, as a coach, oh well, they can run 4:09. And now I'm in a situation where, hey, there's some guys in here who run 4:08, 4:09, 4:10. Let's go race with them. So I think you've got to kind of, just focus on racing, finishing fast, and then wait for the right situation where you can put up that kind of time. I mean, that's my personal philosophy. I know some people might just say, hey, let's just keep going out and running the pace as long as we can. But that's really never worked for me. And it's funny because Mill and I talked a lot lately just about, hey, what's the best way to get the like the world championship standard in the 5,000, which is like basically 61 pace. Is it better to be running 62, 63s and close in a really fast last thousand, last mile? And that's always been my philosophy is that, like, hey, if you're finishing fast, that shows that you're ready to take the next step. So now we just got to wait on the right situation. But yeah, I would be racing that athlete. If they've got it, good enough speed, they can be competitive on the 4x4. I put them in there, run the 800. The 1,000 is a great race indoors. I think it's a really good indicator of what you can do in the mile. So I would be running a variety of races, focus on just competing, finishing fast, and then just kind of wait for that situation to run that 4:09.
The situation I'm about to say kind of relates to pros, high schoolers, and collegiates. Let's assume cross country season maybe took a little bit of downtime, but now they want to run some, early season meets decently fast in January. But the focus is June, right? The national meet, high school, college. USA's is probably roughly June, July this year in Eugene, as it always is. Let's please change that if you're from USATF listening. Don't want to go to Eugene every year. How do you approach that from a training
I'm with you.
perspective?
I'm with you on that.
Good, good. Another podcast for another time. I could rant
Yeah.
about Eugene for a hot minute, but how do you structure that, right? You want to run fast in January. You can't, maintain or hold a peak for 6 months. How do you get an athlete ready, to run fast? And what's the, training cycles look like generally?
So it's kind of something that, to be honest with you, I kind of had this thought, but I think working with Hobbs kind of crystallized it. He talked about it a lot. When I first started working with him, of this thing of training being low cost, high value, right? Like we're trying to say, hey, like let's be really careful about doing those high cost efforts in training. Um, so my thing is, my training philosophy is like we should always be focused on the extremes of the training spectrum: speed and power, and anaerobic development. Okay. And those are things that you can do on a year round, but those are fundamentals. That's like the foundation of your building. And a lot of people think, oh, I can't do speed work. I'm not talking about like lactate work like 200. I'm talking about speed like 40 meters, 30 meters, 80 meters, things of that nature. And then aerobic development, your total volume, your LT1, LT2 work, all those types of things. So what I would say to you is like, and you can run pretty fast off of just basically focusing on those two extremes and of your training, and that will carry all the way over through June. And you can race pretty effectively without doing those high cost workouts where you're doing 4 times a mile at 5K pace, or 12 times 400 at mile pace, or 6 times 300 at 800. Those are all workouts that are sometimes necessary, but they're high cost, and we really try to limit those. It's doing those workouts too often or racing too often that's going to lead you to declining fitness when you get to June. Okay. But if you're really focused on speed and power and aerobic development, that's something you can carry on a year-round basis, and you can still race pretty effectively off of that.
What are the types of workouts that you think peak athletes too fast and they should not be doing year round?
Yeah, just like the speed endurance, the high intensity workouts. longer reps at 800 pace, like a whole bunch of twos, threes, fours, sixes at 800 pace. Very high cost workout. Longer intervals, 300, 400s, 500s at 1500 pace. Once again, a very high cost workout. And I'm not saying you should never do these. They have their time and place. And then I'd say, like, when you start doing mile repeats, thousands, 1200s at your goal 5K pace, like what we used to think of as a true VO2 max workout. So I think those are the types of workouts that you have a limited number of those per training cycle, per macro cycle. So you don't, we don't really want to do those too often.
Story time here. I think something growing up in the sport was that I heard frequently was basically there are two types of athletes, ones who have kicks and ones who don't. Those who have kicks can't run strength stuff well. Those who don't have kicks are generally really good at the strength stuff. I kind of bought into this belief, unfortunately. And then, so high school had this belief that I didn't have a good kick. And I really think it negatively impacted me, specifically within races or when I would do speed work, within my training, within my practices. And then the funny part of the story is this past summer it was taking a little bit of a break from running, felt kind of burnt out from it. And the thing that was exciting to me in my head was actually doing speed work for two reasons. Never really had done, and I know speed work is like very broad and, we could define that, but faster work on the track, touching paces I'd never touched before for shorter reps, things like, 50s, ones, twos, etc. And so got on the track for two reasons. One, this sounded very exciting to me. And two, just with how busy my work schedule was, and maybe I definitely should have warmed up more. You probably would have had a heart attack, but I was like, this is going to take no time. I'm used to doing like mile repeats for ages, and that takes half my day and, work's my top priority at this time in my life. So, it's kind of cool. I can get a really good hard workout and push myself in less than an hour. So that was kind of my impetus for doing that. And very quickly, I feel like I developed so fast in terms of, I was like, wow, if I did this stuff in high school, I think I would have changed my verbiage around whether I had a kick or not. I mean, I went from, and this is exposing how slow I was, but I don't think in high school I ever broke 30 seconds for a 200-meter rep. And I think last December was like the first time I did it doing strides. I broke 30. And then this past summer, like opening up a workout for a 400, I think I ran a very smooth 60. And that was just after a few weeks of doing some basic speed development work. That whole story aside, what's your general perspective? Because I think a lot of people listening buy into the crap that I don't have a kick. And it's really just, well, you probably haven't developed your speed, which is why you don't have a kick. Or, I can't break 30 seconds. It's like, I feel like any reasonably fit high school boy could break 30 seconds with some basic speed development. That was all over the map, but what's your
Yeah,
thought?
yeah. No, I would say I would look at that for two different ways. Okay, one is I think you're correct. I think that in the U.S., I think a lot of coaches, high school, college, or people are afraid of speed and power. Okay, whether because they were a distance runner, I didn't have speed, so they're afraid to do those types of things. They're afraid to do the heavy weightlifting that you need to do to be fast. They're afraid to have their athletes really sprint and practice. So I would agree with you. I think that's an often overlooked part of development. And to me, it's a fundamental part of development. A lot of people say, well, your base mileage, your total volume. Yeah, I agree with that. That's part of it too. But I think that speed and power, not lactate work, we're not going over 20 seconds is a basic part of your foundation. All right, it's I call it one of the twin pillars: speed and power, aerobic development. Now, the other thing I would say is that believing you don't have a kick is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because what happens? Okay, training wise, well, I've got to get stronger, so I'm going to go hammer more 10 milers. I'm going to do more mileage. I'm going to do, and that's could or could not help, And then the second thing is, then how do they choose to run the race? Okay, oh, I don't have a kick, so I'm going to take the pace out from the gun and I'm going to push it from the very beginning. Somebody's sitting right on me the whole way, drafting on me, and then they go blowing by me with 150 to go or 200 to go. It's like, well, why? Because you took it out and you're the one who was doing the leading. It's the way you executed your race that dictated that you didn't have a kick, right? And I see that, and I've had athletes that believe that. And I was like, well, that's just because of your belief system, and then that's how you're executing your races. You're antsy, you're pushing the pace because you don't believe you have a finish. So I think it's two things. I think you're right. Like it's part of it is developing the technique and the power to learn how to run fast. And then secondly, it's that it's a belief, right? And then obviously you have to do the work to have the fitness that you can call up that next gear at the end of the race too.
I'm sure a lot of this comes from training, but something through doing some speed development work for the first time in my life and within these reps was I realized just how far out you could start a kick and like maintain pace and go through gears. That's something I really had never done in training before. And I was just like, wow, oh, I can now tangibly see how some of the pros kick from 300 out and pick it up and go through their gears, every 40, every 50, whatever it might be. I think for me in high school, in cross, it was like, when you saw the finish line and you were confident enough that you weren't going to fall over. And then in track, like the last 100, right, you can see the finish line. And so you think, okay, I'll pick up my arms, I'll move my feet, like the most basic cues. Can you speak more on to the athlete how, if you're starting your kick from 600 out, it's probably not a kick. It's probably like picking it up and maybe going through the gears. But like genuinely, you can run all out for like probably longer than you think you can. And you probably don't have to wait until you can see the finish line tape.
Well, so here's one I might it's once again it's like what percentage reserve are you in, right? And like where are you? How anaerobic are you at that point in time? But I kind of go the opposite direction. Dominic's like, we kind of really work on even making the last 150 meters technical, of hey, 150 to go, you're going to do one thing, 100 to go, you're going to do, and then the last 50 is where you're going to, I call it a spin, and I call it spinning into the finish line, because you can't really do that from 300 out or 200 out. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if you're running 58 pace, but you're capable of running 55, 56 pace like these top professionals, yeah, you can pick it up from 600 out because you're only running 58 pace, right? And you can go to 55 pace from 600 out. But if they're already running at their max ability, then you're not going to be able to pick it up if you're already running 55 pace, you're probably not going to be able to pick it up from 300 out. So we really work a lot on the last 150. My belief is like, your fitness is going to get you to that last 150, and then how you have to execute over the last 150. And this is for the higher level athletes that are running really fast times. But I feel like that strategy has and that philosophy has worked well with me with my best middle distance runners.
A lot of traditionalists within the sport are, I think, pretty anti-strength training. So I want to hear where you fall on this. Can you have a world-class kick without strength training? And if no, what should the work in the gym look like?
I mean, you probably can be a world class athlete without strength training, but when I think about running and kind of to simplify things, and once again, I'll go to those twin pillars of speed and power and aerobic development. For me, it's like there's more things. There's like efficiency, there's energy systems, there's all that, but it's like when it comes down to the basics, like how much power can you put into the track, right? With each footstep, and then how efficient are you at moving red blood cells to your muscles, right? Now, like I said, there's a lot of other stuff that goes into that, but that's just like those two twin pillars. And I've always been a big believer in strength training, and what I feel like a lot of people make the mistake is they don't lift heavy enough. My thing is, if you go in the weight room and watch sprinters lift, like you, as a distance runner, when you go into the weight room, you need to think like a sprinter. You need to lift like a sprinter, because that's what you're doing it for. Like you can get muscle endurance and aerobic, like from running hills or things like that. But so when we go into the weight room, my philosophy has been like, hey, we're going to lift we're not going to lift as much as a sprinter, right? But we're going to have the same philosophy of lifting as a sprinter when we go into the weight room. So it's really focusing on like strength and power when we go into the weight room. And some athletes, yeah, if you've got injury issues, you might have to do some supplemental balance work or, things like that. But ultimately, it's like, what can we do in the weight room that's going to help us put more power into the track when our foot hits the track?
I think one of the biggest fears of athletes within the weight room that I hear quite frequently is they don't want to get like too big or too strong. What's your opinion on that?
That I don't know. I think that's a pretty common mistake people make, thinking that that's going to happen. I mean, if you're spending, you know, 2 hours a day running with warm ups and, or you're running 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 miles a week, and then you're in the weight room 2 sessions a week that last for 45 minutes, your body's going to be more adapted to the running that you're doing. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to make gains in the weight room, but, I think in my whole career, I've had a couple athletes where I was like a little concerned they might have been getting a little too bulky on top from the lifting. But in retrospect, I look back on it now, and it's probably was more like we weren't lifting back then. We were doing some lifts or lifting. We were doing too many reps, too many sets, and that was really the issue. But I've never really, if somebody's training the way they should be with their running, with their volume and the type of running they're doing, I've never really seen that be an issue.
I think some people already knew this coming into this conversation, maybe based on the title, or just have deducted it from our conversations. You brought him up a few times in relation to some of your points. You work with Hobbs Kessler pretty extensively on his speed development, and he talked actually extensively about that in our last conversation post Olympics, how you helped him with that, and how he really thinks that helped elevate and unlock a level of performance that he hadn't previously experienced. Something really unique with Hobbs was he made the team in both the 8 and the 15, which is rarely ever done. And I think a lot of people thought he was just doing the 800 for fun, which maybe he was, knowing Hobbs, but big things came out of it. Take me through your relationship with Hobbs, how it started, as well as like what your work with him looks like, and yeah, any things underneath that category.
Yeah, I mean, I met Hobbs actually just randomly in Yosemite National Park. I was in this parking lot where a lot of climbers camp, and I saw him pull in, and I'd already knew who he was. And I mean, I knew his high school coach, Ron Warhurst, from a long time ago. And Ron had always told me, "Oh, you got to meet him. He's a climber too." And so then when I was at Arizona State, his first semester at Northern Arizona, like I just connected with him, and I would go up on some weekends. We'd go rock climbing, we'd talk training and so forth. And then I just kind of helped him and advised him a little bit here and there. And then, starting more last year, in the fall of 2023, I started, helping a lot more extensively. Initially, just with, looking at his speed development, but then it just became something where, just kind of overlooking, the training that we're all putting together, and then, making suggestions and comments, and helping him where I can.
What are the biggest lessons and learnings from working with Hobbs? And what would your general, we've talked about this a lot, and I think we probably sold the idea that you should be working on speed if you aren't already, but like, what does that look like tangibly for the listener?
So he'll pretty much every Monday we'll do a speed development day, and so he'll do a warm up run. He'll come back. He'll do hurdle walkovers. He'll do some A skips. He'll do some straight leg bounds. We'll do a front side march into a front side run. We'll do some bunny hops. And so my typical uh, progression for a speed development might be, we'll do like 40, 80, and some 120s at 1500 pace. So, like for him, like 5.4 to 5.6. So that's 54 to 56 pace, right, per 40-meter segment. Then he might do a 40, 80, 120 at first lap 800 pace. So that's 50 to 51. So that's like 5.0, 5.1 per 40-meter increment. And just depending on his level of fatigue and the type of day we have, then we might say, hey, let's do, 3 times 40 meters at 400 pace. So it might be like 4.6. for him. And then occasionally we'll say, hey, let's run a 40 at 100%, or flying 30s, where we'll do a 30 build to a 30 fly, and do those at max velocity. Um, we'll do, this fall we kind of initiated something new. He did a lot of sled pulls, just working on his power and learning how to attack the ground, how to push the ground. Um, and we'll do 20-meter starts. Um, if you us start in the Olympic trials, you can see why I need that. So that's a pretty typical speed development. And then we may come back a second day of the week and do a toned down version of that. So it's two things. It's neuromuscular, so we're able to do a lot of work at his 1500, 800 pace at low cost, because he's not doing, things over 20 seconds. He's not doing 200s and 300s at 800 pace or 1500 pace. We're doing a lot of 40s, 80s, and 120. So he can get some good neuromuscular work at those paces with very low cost. And then it's just the speed power aspect of it. To get faster, you have to sprint. You have to learn how to attack the track with your feet. So that's been a big part of it as well, too, is just really trying to learn how to attack the track.
What's the fastest you've ever seen Hobbs run in practice?
Well, but between the trials and before he went to the training camp in Switzerland, I was with him in flag, and I mean, he was pretty fresh then, and I mean, he was like, pretty much cruising like for 40 meters, like 4.1, 4.2. I mean, Hobbs is plenty fast, and I think he's going to get a lot faster over the next couple of years. But I wouldn't say he's extremely fast. I mean, he's not in a sprint. He's not as fast as like Isaiah Jewett was. I mean, Isaiah Jewett, is probably the fastest middle distance runner I've ever coached. I mean, he could routinely run like 3.8 something, for a 40 meters. But Hobbs is also, I think this year one of his biggest assets was, and I think it was because, for two reasons. One is because he got so strong from his LT work, but also from the speed development. I feel like he was the speeds at which he could cruise. He got to the point where his first lap at 51 and the 8, or him coming through at 151 for the first 800 or 1500. He just kind of looked like he was out for a run, right? It didn't look like he was running fast. And I think that came from both ends of that spectrum, from the speed and power that we did, and then also just because he just got so strong from all the aerobic work that he did.
Putting a bow on all these conversations we've been discussing at length over the past 40 minutes, what would be the takeaway for the listener who maybe hasn't done any speed development, wants to improve and work on that area this winter? Or what are some like tangible, practical things? These people don't have Coach Henner at the track with them guiding them. So what's the like most basic form and fashion that people can start to implement some of the things discussed today?
Yeah, I really like increments of 40, 80, 120, because once again, for most people, you're staying under 20 seconds, so you're not really getting lactate buildup, especially if you take enough rest. Also, because it's easy, you move the decimal point. So for 40 meters, like if you're trying to work on 5-minute mile pace, which is 75 per 400, right, is 7.5. If you're trying to run a 4-minute mile, it's 60 pace, so it's 6.0 for 40. So it's easy then just multiply that by 2 for 80, by 3 for 120. I really like those. They're easy to use, and I think they keep you in that zone where you're getting some good neuromuscular work at a low cost. But I think to me, like, I learned this from especially when I was at USC, from the weight room. We had a really good Tatiana was our strength coach there. She still works with like Michael Norman and Rye Benjamin, and then and Coach Carroll Smith Gilbert, who's still the director at Georgia. If you're lifting hard consistently, and you're sprinting and doing the speed development on a consistent basis, you can do it, and it's low cost. Okay, and that's the thing. I think people, they do a sprinting session, they do a lifting session, and they get sore and they're like, oh well, I shouldn't be doing that. Like, well, no, you just have to be consistent at it, right? So I think the key thing is just, know what your paces are. Start a little, start judiciously. Do a little bit slower, a little bit less than you think you should, and then be consistent with it. And if you do that, you're going to see the long term benefits of both the lifting and the speed development.
Shifting subjects for the last few minutes of this conversation, going way back, I meant to ask you this at the forefront of the conversation, then we got into the weeds, which I loved. Right, we're at this period, as I mentioned, really to open up this conversation of Christmas break for a lot of athletes, right? And for the first time, a lot of athletes, maybe it's different for the high schoolers, but there's no structured practice, and a lot of the collegiate athletes are probably for the first time in a few months, like, oh, I don't have people to train with, I don't have people to push me in workouts, I don't have a coach who's watching over me every single day. One of my favorite quotes I came across in 2024 was the quote, "We don't rise to the standards we have when others are watching. We fall to the standards we have when no one is watching. The only work that really matters is the work that no one sees. It shows you who you really are rather than who you say you are." What's your thought on that quote in relation to maybe this next month where people are solo in their training pursuits?
Yeah, it's a great quote and so true, right? I mean, and that's what the best runners do. And and I'll comment on what I've been so impressed with Hobbs. When he was there's times when last year, as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old athlete. So basically, he's a college age athlete, and going out and knocking out 15, 20K of LT work all on his own out there on Lake Mary Road, just knocking it out, right? And to me, that's like, I'm like, that's just very, very impressive to me. But my thing with, like, if you've just come off of cross country season, maybe you ran at BU and in that race, and like, the main thing for me always has been like, just over Christmas break is like, don't worry about the stopwatch, just get in the work, right? Like, it's going to be a little harder if you're supposed to do 400s or you're doing a tempo run. Maybe with your teammates, you're doing the tempo run at 520 pace and you're out there by yourself. It's windy, cold, you're running 530s. Guess what? It's fine. As long as you're just getting in the work and putting in the effort, it'll all be fine. And you just came off a season of racing and good workouts. And so I always just emphasize to my athletes is like, don't worry too much about the watch. Just get in the work.
As we wrap up 2024 and go into 2025, I think a lot of the athletes listening to this want to take their running to the next level in the next 2 to 3 months. Maybe you want to use this indoor season to build the foundation for an excellent 2025 outdoor season. In your experience as a highly, highly successful coach at multiple levels in the sport, generally from the athletes you've seen who go good to great, what are those biggest things that athletes should be aware of that could take them from good to great? And what's the difference between a good athlete and a great athlete? What are they doing?
And I know it's kind of become cliche, but I think it's like you've got to focus on the process of training and the process of racing. And I think that's, when you can really, so let's say you're doing all the training and it's all up to the level that it should be, and now it's time to race. You've really got to focus on the process of racing, and I break that down into effort, execution, leadership, and fun, right? And I pretty much any race that you run, if you can check off those boxes, you're either going to have a good or a great race. And if it didn't go well, you can usually look at one of those boxes and you didn't do something very well in one of those boxes. And the thing I like about those boxes are they're under your control. Okay, effort, execution, leadership, fun, and if you can really, and I think that's something I did a lot better, kind of, starting my days at USC, Arizona State, Georgia. Now it's like I made a much bigger point of emphasis on those four criteria, and I think my athletes ended up performing a lot better in the bigger situations when they were just focused on the process of racing. So I think that's imperative. Is if you can really Hey, you have your goals. You've looked at the top of the mountain. You know what you're trying to do, right? But now you've got to keep your head down. Okay. Make sure you don't stumble over rocks or fall into a ditch. And that's what the process of racing is like keeping my head down, like, hey, what can I control in this race? And, I've had a lot of success just breaking it down into those four criteria: effort, execution, leadership, and fun.
Coach
As you can
Henner,
tell, I've said those a lot of times.
so I love it. You got to hammer the point in a
Yeah.
world of TikTok brain where people can't retain any sort of information. You got to say it 10 times for it to be drilled into their head. So I love it. Appreciate you doing that. Coach Henner, final question for you, serious question for you. For those who have listened to the conversation today, this deep dive into so many different subjects, what's the final takeaway message that you want to leave the audience with? Can be anything.
I just think that, like, just talking about training, of always addressing speed and power, always addressing aerobic development, and then all the stuff in the middle is icing on the cake. Okay, and then when it comes to the mindset of racing, or the mental approach to racing, like, once again, I go back to, like, hey, focus on the process of racing: effort, execution, leadership, and fun.
I love it. Coach Henner, thank you so much for taking the time to really enlighten me. I feel like I learned so much as well as my audience. I know people are going to be way more equipped than they were 56 minutes ago in terms of thinking through training, racing, lifestyle, the whole 9 yards. Really appreciate all the things you're doing and excited to see all the things you'll get up to, both within the sport of running or on some rock somewhere in Yosemite.
Well, Dominic, you're doing a great job as well. I think you've been really bringing a lot of new information and a lot of personalities to track and field, and congratulations on everything you're doing as well.